guys, it's Amanda and welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another video. Today is the first video of 2024. Happy New Year, and I'm so grateful for this year and I'm so excited to see where it takes us. Today's video, as you can see by the title, I'm going to be going over all of the books that I have read in 2023, and I'm also going to be showing you my reading journal. I'm going to do a whole yearly flip through. This was my first year ever using a reading journal, so I'm very excited. I have some explaining to do and we need a little catch up. As you guys saw, I kind of fell off the face of the earth for a bit, for about a month or so, and that's fine. I actually did not get to finish Vlogmas, which I'm pretty sad about, but I actually caught the flu. Literally like 3 days after my birthday, I caught the flu and I was like a zombie for like 3 weeks. It took everything out of me, so I had no energy to do anything and I was in so much pain. It just was not a great time whatsoever. I had to have a sick Christmas, so that wasn't great. But I'm glad to say that I am feeling a lot better now and I am here and ready for 2024 and all the videos that I'm going to be making this year and all the bookish content to make for you all. Let's get started. So first, I am going to read you some of the stats of this year. Last year, whatever. 2023, I read a total of 39 books, 1,743 pages total. The shortest book I read was Night by Elie Wiesel. The longest book I read was Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. I actually was on a Harry Potter kick all throughout when I was sick with the flu, so I read a lot of Harry Potter. The average book length was 352 pages. The most shelved book I read this year was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. The least shelved was the Bronte sisters novels in one sitting. The average rating I gave all of the books that I read this year was 3.6 stars. And then the highest rated book that I read this year was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. So now let's start the flip through of my reading journal. I'm going to be reading everything to you guys. Yeah, so like I said, this was my first year doing a reading journal, and this reading journal is actually by one of my favorite YouTubers, and she's actually the woman that inspired me to start my own booktube channel, and that is a Clockwork Reader. Her name is Hannah. She is on here on YouTube. I will leave her down below and a link to this journal down below too. But she made her own reading journal a couple years ago and I got it last year for Christmas, and it's one of my favorite things of all time. So this is what I've been using this year, and of course I'm going to be using it until it's all the way filled up. So let's get started with our first book of the year. The first book I read in 2023 was A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen. This is a book that I read for school and I gave it a 2.5 stars. I read it in one day. I read it on January 13th. This is fiction and it is a play and it is about 70 pages, and I was recommended this by school. My favorite quote in this was, "I have duties for myself." That was said by Nora Helmer. Where were you when you read this book? On my couch while watching the movie. I watched the movie and read the book at the same time. The most memorable scene is when Nora is being the baddest bitch of all time. Would you recommend this? Yes, to any woman and to any feminist. What did you learn from this book? To never take shit from any man. And then I drew a little thing. I said, "Well, husband, I am taking away your doll." I put tiny pictures of each book cover on all of these pages. The next book I think was one of my favorite books of the year, and that is none other than The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I read this in physical form and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I started it on December 31st, 2022 and ended it in February 7th. It's fiction and it is 559-ish pages. I'm saying ish because sometimes GoodReads, the number of pages is different from other copies of books. So this was recommended to me by, of course, my favorite booktubers and my Titi Katrina. Favorite quote: "Death is the mother of beauty. And what is beauty? Terror." I read this book while I was on the couch in school and while I was in New York City. Most memorable scene was the gang living in the country house. I loved everything from that point of view in the book. I would recommend this book to anyone who loves the dark academia aesthetic and who loves to learn and to read. What did I learn is don't kill people, and knowledge and beauty is true power. And I wrote, "Beauty is terror. Whatever we call beautiful, we quiver before it." I love that quote too. The next book I read is A Little Bit Wicked, the autobiography of Kristin Chenoweth. Kristin Chenoweth is one of my favorite Broadway stars, and she is a big inspiration to me in my work. So I read this January 24th through February 22nd, 240 pages. And I said this was recommended by our Lord and Savior Kristin Chenoweth. Favorite quote from this is, "Keep on keeping on, and you gotta sing from your hoo-hoo." That is a true statement. When you are singing, I've heard Kristin Chenoweth's technique and many other singers' technique is to breathe and sing from your hoo-hoo. I live by that. I read this at home and in school, and I wrote The Hairdresser. I read most of this book at the hairdresser when I was getting my hair done. Most memorable scene is any memory of her and her best friend, her audition days, and her school days. I would recommend this book to any young actress or singer who dreams of making it big. What did I learn from this book? To love and to learn more about the work that I do. And of course I wrote popular, and I drew Glinda's wand and Elphaba's hat and broomstick. The next book is another book I read for school, and that is Night by Elie Wiesel. I gave this book a 3 to 5 stars. I started it on February 9th and ended it February 22nd. This is an autobiography which was 115 pages. Like I said, I was recommended this by school. My favorite quote from this was, "I have entered the kingdom of night," by Elie. This was seriously a really dark book. It was very eye-opening, and it was really powerful. So I was in school when I read this. The most memorable scenes were the cattle cars and all the descriptions of the dead bodies and the fires. Would you recommend this book? Yes. I said we must never forget such a horrible tragedy in our history. I believe that this should be read by anyone and everyone. And what did you learn? I put never forget, be grateful, and keep loved ones close. The next book, to get me a little happier after that last book, was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban by J.K. Rowling. I read this on physical and audiobook. The audiobook was, of course, Stephen Fry. I gave this a 4 to 5 stars. I started it January 2nd and ended it on March 2nd. I kind of like dipped in back and forth between different books while I was reading this. So it is fantasy. Was it recommended to me by the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. 435 pages. Favorite quote? Ridiculous. Where were you when I read this? I was here at home when I was reading this. Most memorable scene was definitely Crookshanks and Scabbers. I would recommend this book to any witch or wizard who loves magic and good times. What did you learn from this book? Everything always happens for a reason. The next book I finished was Happy Days by Gabby Bernstein. This was a physical copy. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I love Gabby Bernstein and her teachings of the law of attraction, so this was obviously recommended by Gabby herself. Favorite quote is, "If you were free from fear, who would you have the freedom to be?" I was at home in school when I read this. The most memorable scene was definitely Gabby's birth story of how she lost her first baby and then a couple years later had her new baby, and her first baby is like her guardian angel, and I love that. I would recommend this book to anyone who is ready to level up their spiritual journey. I learned to always trust the universe no matter what. Next was one of my most anticipated books of this year, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. Read this physical form and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I started it on February 22nd and ended it on March 10th. It's fantasy and 336 pages. This was recommended to me by Ashleigh from A Frolic Through Fiction here on YouTube. My favorite quote was, "One doesn't need magic if one knows enough stories." I was home when I read this on my chaise lounge, and I also read this at school. Memorable scene was definitely any scene with Shadow, the wolf dog. I loved him. I would recommend this to anyone who loves fairies and dark fantasy and cottagecore. What did you learn from this book? To always be curious and to believe in fairies. Next, I read the selected poems of Emily Dickinson, author, of course, Emily Dickinson, and I read this in physical format. I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I started this on February 28th and ended it on March 12th. 116 pages, and I was recommended this by Morgan Long here on YouTube, and that's actually who made this sweatshirt, "Oh Wondrous You" sweatshirt. Favorite quote? "I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too?" I love that. That's one of my favorite poems of Emily Dickinson. I was at home and I was at school when I read this. I would recommend this to any poetry lover. I definitely think that Emily Dickinson is one of the best poetry writers in our history. What did I learn? Enjoy the little things. The next book I did not like whatsoever, and that is Candide by Voltaire. I had to read this for school, so I read this physically and audibly, and I gave this a 1 star. I started it on March 3rd and ended it on the 13th. This is, of course, a classic, and it is 129 pages. I did not like this at all. It was a requirement for school. I got through it. I like satire, I do, but this was just a lot. So I didn't learn anything. Yeah. Next is another Harry Potter book, and that is Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by J.K. Rowling. This is my favorite book in the Harry Potter series. I read this physically and audibly, and I gave this a 4 to 5 stars. I started it on March 12th and ended it on the 29th. Middle grade fantasy. And this is 734 pages. Who was I recommended by? Again, by Titi Katrina. My favorite quote was this: Cedric was a person who exemplified many of the qualities which distinguished the Hufflepuff house. I am a Hufflepuff, so I love Cedric Diggory with all my heart. I was at home when I read this, and like I said, most memorable scene was any scene with Cedric Diggory. I would recommend this book to any witch or wizard that has magic in their heart. What did I learn from this book is to be good, loyal, a hard worker, and value fair play. Next book I read was Magic Lessons by Alice Hoffman. I read this physically and I gave it a 4 to 5 stars. This is the first book in the Practical Magic series, and this was 396 pages. I was recommended this by Darling Desi, another YouTuber here on BookTube. My favorite quote, of course, in this is, always throw spilled salt over your left shoulder, keep rosemary by your garden gate, plant lavender for luck, and fall in love whenever you can. I was at home, school, and I read it in the car. Most memorable scene is the cottage. I would recommend this book to any witch who loves practical magic, and I learned to be true to myself. The next is These Hollow Vows by Lexi Ryan, physical copy. I gave this book a 4 to 5 stars, but I accidentally colored in the 5th star. So you can see I made that mistake. I read this within 2 days, April 8th through the 10th. This is a fantasy romance and it is 448 pages. I was recommended this by just BookTube in general. My favorite quote is this: Abriella, every star in the sky shines for you. I was in Florida when I read this book. Most memorable scene was the Fae Ball, and I would recommend this to anyone who loves the ACOTAR series, the Court and Thorns and Roses series. It is very, very similar to it. And I learned to be true to yourself and not to do things by the books. The next 2 books are something I'm very surprised that I read. This is too funny. I read The Never King by Nikki St. Crow in physical form, and I gave this book a 3 out of 5 stars. I read this April 10th through the 13th. It is a dark romance, and this one was 192 pages. So this is a dark romance that is based on Peter Pan. I can't even say this out loud. My favorite quote, I just laughed. I burst out laughing when I read this, was, holy sh**, I'm Lost Boy. Yeah. Most memorable scene, the spicy ones. I would recommend this book, yes, to any lover of dark fantasy and Peter Pan. But if you want Peter Pan, the original story, to be ruined for you, then don't pick this book up. And what did I learn from this book is to embrace the dark side. Next, I read the second book in that series, which was The Dark One, and this I gave a 3 out of 5 stars. And I read this on April 13th and finished it on that day too. This was 219 pages. Most memorable quote was actually a better one than the last one. And this is, I will pick darling over my own wings because with her I am already flying. I think that is such a cute quote, even though this book is trashy AF. I was in Florida when I read this. Most memorable scene, the tree scene. And yes, I would recommend this to anyone, like I said before, and to embrace my dark side. Okay, I just had to switch out camera batteries. We're going so well already. The next book I read was These Twisted Bonds, which is the second book of the All Hallow Vows duology, also by Lexi Ryan. I read this physically. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I read it April 14th through the 17th. This was 481 pages, and I was recommended it by BookTube. Favorite quote from this was, "You're no princess, you're my queen." I was in Florida when I read this. Most memorable scene was Under the Waterfall, and I would recommend this book to anyone who loves the ACOTAR series. And what did I learn from this book was to always follow my heart. The next book was another required read for school, and that is Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare. I read this physically, and I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. I read it April 19th through the 27th, and it was 175 pages. My favorite quote from this was, "Veni, vidi, VC. I came, I saw, I conquered. I was in school when I read this. Most memorable scene, of course, was the final battle. I would recommend this play to anyone who loves theater. I feel like you just have to read Julius Caesar at some point in your life. And what did I learn? Was to trust myself. Next is a poetry book, and that is You Are Your Own Fairy Tale by Amanda Lovelace. I read this physically and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I absolutely loved this poetry collection. I read this through March 13th through May 9th, and it was 464 pages. My favorite quote from this is, "Bitch, he spits. Witch, he sneers. And I say, actually, I'm both." I love that quote so much. I was with Sunny, my dog, when I was reading this, at home and also in bed, and I would recommend this to anyone who loves poetry and fairy tales. And I learned to live life to the fullest and be magical. The next book is another book for school, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and no one actually knows who wrote this, so it's an unknown name. I read this physically. I gave it a 2 stars. I read this May 1st through the 8th, and it was 144 pages. I don't have a quote from this. I read it in school, and I said, "Would you recommend this book?" And I said, "No, just read the Spark Notes." And I did not learn anything from this book. Next was Gallant by V.E. Schwab. I read this physically and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I read this May 8th through the 14th. This is fantasy, and this is actually V.E. Schwab's first young adult novel, and this was 338 pages. I was recommended it by BookTube. Favorite quote is, "Home is a choice." I was in bed, school, and on the bus to New York City when I read this. Most memorable scene was any scene when she was exploring the house. And I would recommend this to anyone who loves V.E. Schwab. V.E. Schwab is one of my favorite authors of all time, so I absolutely love this. And I learned to love myself as I am and to always be curious. And the next page is one of Hannah's drawings that she put into this reading journal. The next book was honestly a letdown for me, and that is The Cloisters by Katie Hayes. I read this physically and I only gave it a 3 to 5 stars. I read this May 15th through the 26th. It is fiction and 312 pages. I was recommended this by, again, Ashleigh from A Frolic Through Fiction here on YouTube. Favorite quote was, "But that was the hardest thing about death. The unrelenting march of time forward, away from the person you've lost." That, hits home so much to me. I was in school when I read this. I liked all of the library scenes, of course. I would recommend this to anyone who loves New York City and dark academia, because this book is set in New York City. I just wish there was more to it. I really thought I was really gonna love this book, but I just really didn't. It was okay. I don't remember anything from it right now. I don't. It was okay. And what did I learn from this? I put more and more reasons to move to New York City, because that's where I want to move when I am older. The next book is an absolute classic, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker. The narrator was Mike Bennett. I read this on audiobook and physical form. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I read this through May 27th through June 2nd. This was 488 pages, and I was recommended this by BookTube. Favorite quote was, "Listen to them, the children of the night, what music they make." And then my other favorite quote, because I had to put 2, is, "I've crossed oceans of times to find you." I was outside, at home, in bed, and at school when I read this. Most memorable scenes were all of Dracula's castle and anything describing the castle. And I would recommend this to anyone who loves horror. I feel like it is just an experience you have to experience, is reading Dracula and knowing the source material of so much pop culture. And I learned to be curious and strange and to believe in vampires. The next book was I think this was my favorite book of 2023, and that is Slewfoot, A Tale of Bewitchery by Bram. I read this in physical form and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I read it June 2nd through the 14th, and this was 431 pages, and I was recommended this by Ashleigh from A Frolic Through Fiction. Favorite quote from this was, "You are not made out of needs. You are made out of your dreams and desires." I was at home, in school, and on the couch when I read this. And my most memorable scene was the first broom flight with Abatha and Slewfoot. If you've read this book, you know what I'm talking about. I would recommend this one to anyone, any horror lover and witchy book lover. And I learned to be true to myself and to not care what anyone thinks of me. Be magical and be kind. The next was another 5-star read, and that is The League of Gentlewomen Witches by India Holton. I read this physically and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I read this June 16th through the 23rd, and this was 352 pages, and I was recommended this by darling Desi. My favorite quote is quite of a long one, so it is, "Do not look so concerned on my behalf, Captain. It is a common enough statement. For example, I myself love that house. I love tea. I love you, your smile, and the way you sigh in your sleep. See? Common. Unconcerning. We are still enemies." I was at home and outside when I read this. The most memorable scene was the inn. And I would recommend this book to anyone for Jane Austen lovers and Pirates of the Caribbean lovers. This book was pitched as a mixture of Pirates of the Caribbean and any Jane Austen book, and I just knew that it would be perfect. So I learned to trust my instincts, and true love is surprising sometimes. The next book was another disappointment for me, and that is The Deep by Alma Katsu. I've read this physically and I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. This is a retelling of the Titanic and the Titanic story it is based through there. So this is a horror historical fiction. This was 432 pages, and I just saw this on BookTube. Favorite quote was, "Fear was a chained dog, startling and rough and always dangerously close, stretching its leash, baring his fangs." I was home when I read this. The most memorable scene, honestly, there was not. I thought it was going to be scarier. I thought it was going to be more of a horror book. But the scariest thing that happened, that's why I put this as the memorable scene, was a baby choking on a crucifix. That was the scariest thing that happened in this book, and I was really disappointed. I would recommend this book. I would recommend it, yes. But to anyone who loves the Titanic, but not for those who don't like time jumps and multiple POVs. There was too many time jumps that weren't very specific, and I didn't like the whole multiple POVs. It was kind of confusing a lot, and I didn't learn anything from this book. The next book was House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. I read this physically and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I read this July 10th through the 12th, and it is 304 pages. I was recommended this by Ashleigh from A Frolic Through Fiction. My favorite quote was, "In the end, there are only those who eat and those who bleed." And another quote is, "Consumption is the highest honor." I was home and in bed when I read this. Most memorable scenes were the ball and all of the bleedings. And I would recommend this book to anyone who loves gothic literature and vampire romances. And what did I learn from this book? Be careful what you wish for. Next is another 5-star book, which I was very, very surprised by, and this is House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland. I read this physically. I read this July 16th through the 17th, and this was 292 pages, and again, this was recommended by Ashleigh. Favorite quote was, "I am the thing in the dark." I was at home and I was in Skinny-Atlas when I read this. The most memorable scene was any scene in the in-between, if you know what I mean. Stop rhyming. And I would recommend this for any creepy fairy tale lovers and horror lovers. What did I learn? Is we are all unique and we are all beautiful. Next is another 5-star book, and this book I read now 3 times, and that is Midnight Sun by Stephanie Meyer. I read this physically, and I read this July 20th through August 2nd. I always read this. I've been reading it every single year for the anniversary of when it first came out in 2020. This was 658 pages, and my favorite quote from this book is, "For a second I saw Persephone, pomegranate in hand, doing herself to the underworld." I was at home, outside, and in the car going to New York City. Most memorable scenes were the meadow, eating the Cullens, and of course the baseball scene. And I would recommend this book to anyone who is Team Edward, because of course. And what did I learn from this book is trust the timing of life and our afterlife. Next book was My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. I read this physically and I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. I read this through August 3rd through the 8th, and this was 337 pages, and I was recommended this by darling Desi. Favorite quote was, this was the very last line in this book, and it is, "They didn't make it to Halley's Comet, but they tried." I was home, bed, and in couch, and the most memorable scene was, of course, the huge exorcism at the very end of the book. And I would recommend this to anyone who loves 80s and Stranger Things. It is very much similar to the Stranger Things vibes. And I learned that friendship is the most powerful magic of all. Next book was a classic, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I did this through audiobook and physically, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. This is similar to Dracula. I just wanted to read it for the experience and to understand the source material. I read this August 10th through the 16th, and of course this is a classic horror, and this was 260 pages. I was recommended this by, of course, any horror person ever, and Christey and Jones here on YouTube. My favorite quote was, "Beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful." I was in the car, home, and in bed when I read this book. The most memorable scene was the death of Victor Frankenstein and the monster weeping over his creator. I would recommend this for anyone who loves classic horror and dark academia, and I learned that knowledge is power. Next is another 5-star read, and that is none other than Shadow of Night by Deborah Harkness. I read this physically. I read it August 16th through September 20th. This was 577 pages. This was recommended to me by, again, Morgan Long and Darling Desi. This is the second book in the All Souls trilogy. My favorite quote was, "Magic is just desire made real, and in every ending, there is a new beginning." I was home, outside, school, and in the school library when I was reading this book. Most memorable scene was, "Who has your heart, Diana? If you know what I mean, you know what I mean." And of course, Shakespeare writing at the very end. I absolutely loved that part. I would recommend this to anyone. I said, yes, if you loved the first book, you'll love the second book even more of the All Souls trilogy. Again, I loved it so much. And I learned to trust the magic inside me, think, and stay alive. The next book was another book I read for school, and that is Into the Wild by John Crocker. I'm probably saying that wrong, I'm sorry. I read this physically and audiobook. I read this September 25th through October 13th. I gave this a 2 out of 5 stars. Favorite quote was, "Living like McCandless." I was in school when I read this. Most memorable scene was anytime the woods was described. There was amazing imagery in this book, and I really loved that. And yes, I would recommend this book to those who love nature and biographies, and I learned to always be curious and adventurous. Next book was The Book of Magic by Alice Hoffman. This is technically the third book in the Practical Magic series, and I gave this a 4 to 5 stars. I read this September 25th through October 31st, and this was 400 pages, and this was recommended to me by, again, my titi Katrina. Favorite quote was, "Read as many books as you can, choose courage over caution, take time to visit libraries, look for the light in the darkness, have faith in yourself, know that love is what matters most." And I was home, school, and in the car when I read this book. Most memorable scene was when Jet and Franny went to New York City and was in Forest Hills. Part of my family has grown up in Forest Hills, New York. That meant so much to me that Forest Hills was actually mentioned in this book. So I recommend this to anyone who loves the Practical Magic series, and I learned to always be myself and to be magical. The next 2 books are, again, a very dark romance, and I read Haunting Adeline by H.D. Carlton. I read this physically. I gave the first book a 4 to 5 stars. I read this November 1st through the 19th, and this was 551 pages. I was recommended this from BookTube. Favorite quote was, "Run, little mouse. I catch you, I f*** you." Yeah, I was in bed and at home when I read this. Most memorable scenes was Satan's Affair, The House of Mirrors. If you know, you know. I would recommend this for anyone who enjoys dark romance. And what did I learn from this book? Lock my doors. And then I read the second book in this series, which I didn't like as much as the first one, but the second one is Hunting Adeline, again by H.D. Carlton. I read this physically. I only gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I started this on December 3rd and finished it on December 11th, and this was 531 pages. My favorite quote was this: "They see me as a diamond because I have Zaid's love. They fail to remember that's what forged me into a stone so unbreakable." I was home and in bed when I read this. Most memorable scene was the bathtub. I would recommend this for anyone who loves dark romance. And from this book, I learned to embrace the darkness. Next book I read was Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix by J.K. Rowling. I read this in physical form, and I gave this a 4 to 5 stars. I read this December 17th through the 27th, and this was 912 pages. This was recommended to me by Titi Katrina. My favorite quote was, "You have the emotional range of a teaspoon." Of course, Hermione said that. I was home and in bed when I read this. This was when I had the flu, so I was reading a lot of Harry Potter. The most memorable scene was the trial, and of course I would recommend this to any witch or wizard, and I learned to be brave and live a magical life. And the last 2 books I read in 2023 were 2 really tiny books, and that is Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters' writings in one sitting. I read this physically. and I gave both of them a 4 to 5 stars. I started it on December 29th and finished them December 31st. The first one, Jane Austen, was 208 pages, and the Bronte Sisters was 200 pages. I was recommended this by the BookTube community. My favorite quote was from Jane Austen, "Time will explain. I was home, couch, and in bed." Most memorable scenes were of all of Northanger Abbey from Jane Austen. I love Northanger Abbey, and that's one of my favorite Jane Austen novels. I would recommend these 2 small books to anyone who loves the classics. What did I learn from this book? These books is the best books are always written by women. And that's all I have to say there. So those are all the books that I read in 2023, a total of 39 books. That is a lot more than I read last year, so I'm very proud of myself, and I'm excited to see how many books I will read in 2024, and I'm excited to get started with my reading for this year. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you guys so much for being a part of my journey through 2023 and being a part of my little corner here on YouTube. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, please hit the like button, hit subscribe if you have not already, and click the notification bell so you'll be notified every single time that I upload. If you want to find me anywhere else, you can find me on Instagram, TikTok, GoodReads, Pinterest, and in between the pages of a book. And as always, remember to be the Captain Jack Sparrow of your story, and may your compass lead you to amazing things. And I shall see you guys in my next video. Happy 2024!